7 minutes past midnight, the 9th of March, 1945. 279 American B-29 bombers, flying lower than any heavy bomber crew had been trained to fly over a defended city, crossed into Japanese airspace above Tokyo. Engines droning through clear, cold, unusually dry air that meteorologists on Guam had flagged days earlier as close to ideal for what was about to happen below. They carried almost no bullets. Their gun turrets had been stripped out and left behind on Guam and Tinian and Saipan, along with most of their defensive ammunition, to make room for something else entirely. Below them, in the wooden houses and narrow lanes of one of the most densely populated urban districts on the planet, families were asleep, unaware that the air raid sirens that had become a nightly nuisance over the preceding weeks were, this time, not a drill and not another disappointing high-altitude raid that would scatter its bombs across empty farmland the way so many had before it. Within 3 hours, 16 square miles of the largest city in the Japanese Empire would cease to exist in any recognizable form, and somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians who had nothing to do with the war being fought in their name, would be dead. This is the real story of Operation Meetinghouse, the single most destructive air raid in the history of human warfare. More people killed in one night than either atomic bomb would kill on its own 5 months later, and the one American general who ordered it entirely on his own authority, without waiting for permission from anyone above him. If you want the real, documented history of the war in the Pacific, not the sanitized version, this channel exists to tell it straight. This one asks a question that historians still haven't fully answered, so stay with it to the end. To understand how the United States ended up firebombing a city of civilians, you have to understand how badly the war against Japan's industry had been going just months earlier. The B-29 Superfortress had been the most expensive weapons program in American history up to that point, more expensive even than the Manhattan Project that would eventually produce the atomic bomb, and by early 1945, it was failing to justify a fraction of that investment. American strategy called for precision daylight bombing, sending waves of B-29s at extreme altitude, above 30,000 feet, to hit specific factories and rail yards with the kind of surgical accuracy American air doctrine had built its entire reputation on over the skies of Germany. A doctrine built on the Norden bomb site and years of training that had, at least in theory, allowed American crews to claim they could put a bomb inside a pickle barrel from 5 miles up. Over Japan, that doctrine ran into a problem nobody had fully anticipated, because nobody flying combat missions at that altitude over the home islands had encountered anything quite like it before. The jet stream, a river of high-altitude wind, blowing across the Japanese home islands at speeds sometimes exceeding 200 miles an hour. A phenomenon barely understood by meteorologists at the time and never factored into the original B-29 targeting doctrine. Scattered bombs released from that height across miles of open ground, hitting farmland and empty streets as often as it hit anything resembling a war industry target, sometimes carrying bombs released with careful precision more than a mile off their intended aim point by the time they reached the ground. Add near-constant cloud cover over Japan's cities, which frequently forced crews to bomb by radar rather than visual sighting, and further degraded whatever accuracy the altitude hadn't already ruined, and engines straining at the outer limits of what they could reliably do at that altitude. Prone to failures that cost aircraft and crews on missions that never even reached their targets. And months of missions had produced results embarrassing enough that senior Army Air Forces leadership was seriously questioning whether the entire B-29 program could be salvaged at all. Japan had not been entirely untouched by American air power before that January. Almost 3 years earlier, in April of 1942, 16 B-25 bombers under Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle had launched from the carrier USS Hornet, several hundred miles further from Japan than the mission had originally planned for, after the task force was spotted early by a Japanese picket boat, for a one-way raid on Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. A mission with real strategic value, mostly as a morale-boosting gesture rather than a serious attempt at destroying industrial capacity, since the small, lightly armed bombers could carry only a token bomb load each, and none of them had enough fuel to return to the carrier, forced instead to try to reach airfields in China after dropping their bombs, most of them crash-landing or ditching along the way. The Doolittle raid proved a raid on the Japanese home islands was possible, and it stung Japanese military leadership badly enough that it contributed directly to the decision to expand Japan's defensive perimeter into the disastrous Midway operation 2 months later. It did essentially nothing on its own to slow Japan's actual war production, and Japanese air defenses around Tokyo, while never as dense as those ringing the major cities of Germany, had spent the following years assuming any serious future American bombing campaign would resemble the high-altitude daylight raids the Army Air Forces had made their signature over Europe, an assumption LeMay's tactics that March would prove badly, catastrophically wrong. Curtis LeMay arrived in the Mariana Islands in January of 1945 to take command of 21 Bomber Command, 38 years old, already a legend inside the Army Air Forces for building the tight combat box bomber formations that had helped the 8th Air Force survive its brutal early campaigns over Germany. A commander known for flying the most dangerous missions himself rather than sending men somewhere he wouldn't go, his face partially frozen from a bout of Bell's palsy that left him with a permanent scowl photographers loved and subordinates found intimidating. He inherited a bombing campaign that was, by every meaningful measure, failing. General Hap Arnold, who had personally staked much of his own career and credibility on the B-29 program, needed results, and he needed them before critics in Washington, watching billions of wartime dollars flow into a bomber that couldn't reliably hit its targets, started asking questions Arnold had no good answers for. Arnold had risked his own reputation pushing the Superfortress into production years ahead of a conventional development timeline, betting that the aircraft's range and payload would prove decisive against Japan the way heavy bombers had proven decisive, if imperfectly, over Germany. By early 1945, that bet looked close to failing, and the pressure running down the chain of command from Arnold to LeMay was not subtle. What LeMay decided to do about it was as radical a change in doctrine as any single commander made in the entire war. He abandoned high-altitude daylight precision bombing for Tokyo almost entirely. In its place, he ordered his crews to fly at night, at altitudes as low as 5,000 feet, well within range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns that had been positioned specifically to defend against exactly this kind of low approach, a decision that inverted nearly every assumption American bomber doctrine had operated under since the start of the war. To offset that risk, LeMay made a calculation that stunned even some of his own crews when they heard it. He ordered the B-29s stripped of most of their defensive armament, guns and ammunition both, leaving many aircraft with only their tail gunners' positions still armed, on the theory that Japanese night fighter defenses were weak enough, and American losses to flak survivable enough that the trade-off was worth it if it meant each bomber could instead carry several tons more incendiary ordnance, weight that had previously gone toward gun turrets, ammunition belts, and the additional crew members needed to operate them. In place of high-explosive bombs meant to shatter factory walls, the aircraft would carry M69 incendiary bombs, a jellied gasoline compound related to napalm, packed into small canisters roughly the size and shape of a stick of firewood, dropped in clusters that scattered dozens of individual bomblets across a wide area rather than exploding as a single large charge, each one designed specifically to ignite and keep burning against the wood and paper construction that made up the overwhelming majority of ordinary Japanese homes. The weapon had been developed and refined over the preceding 2 years, partly through tests conducted on full-scale mock-ups of Japanese and German residential neighborhoods, built from scratch in the Utah desert specifically to study how efficiently different incendiary designs could burn down the kind of housing American planners expected to encounter in both theaters. A research program that treated the destruction of ordinary homes as a straightforward engineering problem to be optimized well before the tactic was ever used in anger over Tokyo. This was not a plan built around hitting a specific factory or rail junction. It was a plan built around setting an entire section of a city on fire and letting the fire itself do the rest of the work no precision bomb had managed to do from 6 miles up. LeMay made this decision almost entirely on his own authority. Concerned that requesting formal approval through the normal chain of command might get the plan rejected or delayed by superiors uneasy about the casualties, both American and Japanese, that such a radical change in tactics might produce, he briefed Arnold's chief of staff, General Loris Norstad, on the broad outline of what he intended to do, and then proceeded without waiting for a fuller review to work its way back from Washington. It was an extraordinary amount of independent authority for one general to exercise over a decision of this scale, and LeMay understood exactly what he was risking. If the mission failed, if American losses were catastrophic, or the results proved as disappointing as the high-altitude raids before it, the responsibility would land on him alone, with no formal sign-off from above to share it with. LeMay himself later described weighing that personal risk in strikingly plain terms, reasoning that if the tactic worked, it would shorten the war and save American lives, and if it failed badly enough, his own career would absorb the consequences rather than the wider Army Air Force's leadership that had staked so much of its own credibility on the B-29 program already. He briefed his own crews on the new tactics only shortly before the mission launched, and by several accounts the response inside the briefing rooms on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan was somewhere between disbelief and open alarm. Veteran crews who had spent months training and fighting under the assumption that altitude and defensive firepower were what kept a bomber crew alive, now being told, days before a major mission, that both of those assumptions were being abandoned at once. The target LeMay selected for the night of the 9th of March was an area of roughly 4 miles by 3 in Tokyo's Shitamachi district, encompassing the Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa wards, some of the most densely populated working-class neighborhoods in the entire city. Packed with small workshops and family homes built almost entirely from wood, chosen in part precisely because of that population density and construction, which made the incendiary tactic far more effective there than it would have been against a district of stone and steel. American planners chose the date deliberately for a stretch of dry, windy weather, conditions meteorologists predicted would help any fire that started spread faster and burn hotter than it otherwise would. The same basic physics that had driven Allied target selection during the firebombing raids on Hamburg and Dresden in the European theater the previous year. Raids that had already demonstrated, at a smaller scale, how effectively a concentrated incendiary attack could generate a self-sustaining firestorm capable of killing far more people than the raw tonnage of bombs dropped would normally predict. Everything about the mission's design, the altitude, the incendiaries, the target, the weather, pointed toward the same outcome, and every planner involved understood what that outcome was likely to be for the people living inside the target area when the bombs began to fall. What happened after midnight on the 9th of March exceeded even LeMay's own expectations for how effective the tactic would be. The first wave of bombers, A specially designated group of Pathfinder aircraft dropped their incendiaries in a rough X pattern across the target district, marking the aim point for the hundreds of bombers following behind them, and the fires that ignited along those lines quickly outran anything the fires that came before it in the war had done, merging into a single firestorm that generated its own weather system, winds strong enough to snap full-grown trees and pull the fire forward faster than a person could run from it. Crews in later waves, arriving over a target already burning out of control, described a glow visible from more than 100 miles out, bright enough that some pilots initially mistook it for the sunrise still hours away, and turbulence from the rising heat so severe that some aircraft were tossed thousands of feet off their planned altitude without warning. Gunners and bombardiers thrown against their restraints as though the plane had hit solid ground. Temperatures inside the firestorm reportedly passed 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to liquefy asphalt in the streets and boil the water in canals where residents had fled hoping the water would protect them. Later waves of bombers, arriving after the fire was already established, reported being able to smell burning flesh through their own aircraft at altitudes of several thousand feet, an odor several crew members later said they never fully stopped associating with that specific mission for the rest of their lives. By the time the last aircraft turned for home, roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes after the raid began, the districts marked on LeMay's target map had ceased to exist in any form anyone on the ground that morning would have recognized. American losses that night were remarkably light given the scale of what the mission achieved. 14 aircraft lost out of the force sent, a fraction of what LeMay's own staff had projected going in. A fact LeMay would later point to as vindication of the entire gamble, stripped guns and all. On the ground, the people living inside the target district faced a version of the raid that no aircrew flying above it ever fully witnessed. Standard civil defense guidance in Tokyo at the time instructed residents to fight small fires as they started, forming bucket brigades and using simple hand pumps, guidance that had worked reasonably well against the smaller, more scattered raids of the preceding months, and proved catastrophically inadequate against a firestorm of this scale, since no bucket brigade in human history has ever extinguished a fire generating its own hurricane-force winds. Local air raid wardens, trained under doctrine that assumed individual house fires rather than a single interconnected inferno, found their entire framework for managing an emergency collapsing within the first 20 minutes of the raid, unable to coordinate any organized response once the fire had grown beyond anything a neighborhood-level system was ever designed to handle. Streets that should have offered an escape route instead became funnels for wind and flame, moving faster than anyone could run. And survivors described watching people ahead of them simply stop moving, overcome by heat or smoke, while others jumped into the Sumida River and nearby canals only to find the water itself approaching a boil in the hours after midnight. Entire families were found afterward huddled together in shelters that had offered no real protection at all, killed not by direct flame but by the superheated air and smoke that the firestorm pulled through every enclosed space in its path. A mechanism of death that meant many victims showed no burns at all, having suffocated or been asphyxiated by superheated gases before the flames themselves ever reached them. Estimates of exactly how many died that night vary by source, in part because so many bodies were never fully recoverable, reduced by the heat to ash and bone fragment in numbers that made an accurate final count effectively impossible for the Japanese authorities trying to compile one in the raid's immediate aftermath, working in a city where entire municipal record-keeping systems for several wards had themselves burned, along with everything else. The human cost was staggering even by the standards of a war that had already produced Stalingrad and the Blitz and the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden in the European theater. conservative estimates place the death toll at a minimum of 80,000 people. The most credible estimates, cited by multiple post-war assessments, including the U.S. Department of Energy's own historical review, put the number closer to 100,000, killed in a single night, in a raid that dropped no atomic weapon and split no atom. More than 1 million people were left homeless. 16 square miles of the city were destroyed outright. Roughly 40% of Tokyo's built area gone in one raid. By the numbers alone, Operation Meetinghouse killed more people in one night than the atomic bombing of Nagasaki would kill 5 months later. And depending on which estimates you use for both raids, came close to or exceeded the immediate death toll at Hiroshima as well. There was an additional irony buried in the wreckage that almost nobody involved in planning the raid knew about at the time, and that took decades to fully surface in the historical record. The same campaign of incendiary raids on Tokyo that spring destroyed Building 49 of the Riken Research Institute, the facility housing Japan's own, far less advanced attempt to develop an atomic weapon under a physicist named Yoshio Nishina. The Japanese program had never come close to the scale or funding of the American Manhattan Project. Hampered by a fraction of the resources, materials, and manpower the United States had thrown at its own bomb. But it had been a genuine, ongoing research effort, one of several parallel wartime attempts around the world to unlock the same physics. Conventional incendiary bombs meant to burn down wooden houses ended that program before it had gotten anywhere close to viable, months before the American bomb that would eventually end the war was ever dropped. An accident of targeting that meant the deadliest conventional air raid in history and the end of Japan's own nuclear ambitions happened, essentially by coincidence, in the same spring, in the same city, without either side fully realizing the connection until long after the war was over. Word reached Arnold within hours, and his reaction set the tone for how the raid would be received at every level above LeMay for the rest of the war. Reconnaissance photographs taken over Tokyo the following day showed a scale of destruction that exceeded anything American planners had achieved in a single mission against any target, in either theater, at any point in the war. Arnold, who had spent months worried the B-29 program might be remembered as an expensive failure, sent LeMay a personal message of congratulations, and the tactical report on Operation Meetinghouse was treated inside Army Air Force's headquarters not as a troubling escalation requiring careful review, but as proof of concept for a doctrine that could now be applied as widely and as quickly as aircraft and incendiary bombs could be made available. Whatever hesitation might have existed at higher levels of command about the deliberate targeting of civilian residential areas evaporated almost entirely once the results came back, and no serious internal effort to reconsider the tactic followed for the remainder of the war. LeMay did not describe the raid in his own post-war writing as a mistake or a tragedy he'd been forced into. In his 1965 memoir, he wrote plainly that his crews knew going in that they were going to kill a large number of women and children when they burned that section of the city, and that he considered it necessary anyway, a judgment he never significantly revised in public for the rest of his life. He was hailed as a hero for what the raid accomplished. Awarded medals and the tactics proven over Tokyo, that march became the template for the rest of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. Over the following 5 months, X-21 Bomber Command extended the same basic formula: low-altitude night raids, incendiary payloads, dense residential targeting, to Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller Japanese cities. A campaign that by the war's end had destroyed roughly 40% of the built-up area across 66 Japanese cities and killed an estimated 300,000 to 900,000 civilians in total, a range wide enough that historians still debate the true figure, but staggering under any version of it. American bomber crews, having proven the concept over Tokyo at a cost of only 14 aircraft, applied the same tactics with a confidence that had been entirely absent from the failed high-altitude campaign only weeks earlier. And Japanese civilian defense, already overwhelmed on the night of the 9th of March, never developed an effective answer to a form of warfare built specifically around burning entire neighborhoods rather than striking discrete targets within them. City after city followed a pattern that had become almost routine by the summer of 1945. Air raid sirens, a wave of low-flying bombers, a firestorm, and a morning-after reconnaissance photograph showing another wide swath of a Japanese city reduced to ash. A rhythm so consistent that some smaller cities reportedly experienced a strange, dark form of relief when their turn finally came. Since the waiting itself, watching city after city on the list burn while wondering when their own name would come up, had become its own kind of psychological toll on a civilian population that had almost no ability to influence when or whether the bombers would arrive. LeMay's career did not end with the war. He went on to build and command the Strategic Air Command through the tensest years of the early Cold War, the officer most responsible for turning America's nuclear bomber force into a constantly ready, globally deployed deterrent. And his reputation for cold, unsentimental calculation about mass casualties followed him the entire way. Decades later, in 1968, he ran for vice president on a third-party ticket alongside segregationist Alabama Governor George Wallace, a campaign remembered today mostly for LeMay's own public comments suggesting the use of nuclear weapons should not be treated as an unthinkable last resort. Comments that reportedly startled even Wallace's own campaign staff and that many historians credit with helping sink the ticket's chances. The same bluntness that had made him willing to order the deadliest air raid in history without waiting for permission from above followed him into public life 23 years later, and he never seemed to fully understand why so many people found it disqualifying rather than simply honest. Here's the thing worth sitting with, because this is genuinely one of the harder moral questions to come out of the entire war, argued seriously by historians, ethicists, and veterans of the campaign itself for 8 decades without landing on a settled answer. The case for what LeMay did rests on the brutal arithmetic of a war that both sides had already stopped fighting by anything resembling the old rules. Japan's military-industrial production was deliberately dispersed into small, home-based workshops throughout residential neighborhoods, specifically to make precision targeting harder, which meant that by 1945, a meaningful share of Japan's war production genuinely was happening inside the same wooden buildings where families slept, a fact that doesn't make the civilians inside those buildings legitimate targets under any modern understanding of the laws of war, but does complicate the clean line between military and civilian target that the raid is usually judged against. Proponents of the raid, then and since, have argued that shortening the war by any real margin, through Tokyo or through the atomic bombs that followed it, saved a far larger number of lives on both sides than an invasion of the Japanese home islands would have cost, an invasion American planners were actively preparing for, codenamed Operation Downfall, and projecting casualty estimates in the hundreds of thousands to well over 1 million between American and Japanese forces combined. Figures that some historians treat as inflated to justify decisions already made, and others treat as a serious, defensible estimate of what a land invasion of a defended home island genuinely would have cost. Japanese civilian and military authorities were, by the summer of 1945, actively preparing a homeland defense doctrine that mobilized not just soldiers but civilians, including women and older children, to resist an invasion with whatever weapons could be improvised. Sharpened bamboo spears distributed in some regions where firearms weren't available, a preparation that suggests the civilian death toll from a full invasion, layered on top of the military casualties on both sides, could plausibly have exceeded even the combined toll of every firebombing raid and both atomic bombs. Whether that specific counterfactual justifies what actually happened in March, rather than simply explaining why it happened, is exactly the kind of distinction historians studying this period return to again and again without ever fully resolving it to everyone's satisfaction. The case against it doesn't require rejecting that broader argument about ending the war faster to still find Operation Meetinghouse indefensible on its own specific terms. This was not a raid that went wrong or hit unintended targets through the fog of war. It was designed, from the altitude to the incendiary payload to the choice of a dry, windy night, specifically to maximize civilian casualties in a dense residential area, by a commander who said afterward, without much equivocation, that he understood exactly what the raid would do to the people living there, and ordered it anyway. Modern definitions of a war crime, definitions that didn't fully exist in codified international law until years after this raid happened, generally center on exactly this kind of deliberate targeting of civilian populations for the purpose of causing mass casualties and terror, rather than degrading a specific, identifiable military capability. LeMay himself, in one of the more startling admissions any senior American commander made about his own conduct in the entire war, reportedly told an aide privately that he understood that if the United States had lost the war, he would very likely have been tried as a war criminal for exactly this raid. He said it, by his own account, without regret, and he never asked anyone to grant him one. That admission is worth sitting with on its own terms. It did not come from a critic, decades later, applying modern standards backward onto a wartime decision. It came from the man who ordered the raid, describing his own understanding of what he had done in language that leaves very little room for the more comfortable version of this story, where nobody involved really grasped the moral weight of what was happening until much later. Part of what makes Operation Meetinghouse harder to judge by later standards is that the legal framework we now use to judge it barely existed in March of 1945. The Geneva Conventions in force at the time said almost nothing specific about aerial bombardment of cities, a gap in international law that reflected how recently air power itself had become capable of this kind of destruction, rather than any settled judgment that such raids were acceptable. The more detailed protections against targeting civilian populations that modern international humanitarian law relies on were largely written after the Second World War, in direct response to exactly this kind of bombing campaign, on both the Allied and Axis sides of the conflict. That timing cuts both ways in the argument. It means LeMay was not violating any specific codified law that existed at the time he gave the order, a fact his defenders point to often. It also means the absence of a law against something is a thin defense for an act everyone involved already understood, in plain moral terms, to be the deliberate killing of a civilian population. A distinction LeMay's own private admission about being tried as a war criminal suggests he understood better than the legal technicality might imply. The success of Operation Meetinghouse also shaped decisions that came after it in ways worth understanding on their own terms. By the time President Truman was weighing the decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan that summer, the American military and public had already absorbed, over 5 months, the reality that firebombing raids killing tens of thousands of Japanese civilians in a single night had become a normal, repeated feature of the war, rather than a singular, shocking exception. Some historians studying the atomic bomb decision have argued that this normalization mattered, that a leadership already accustomed to authorizing mass civilian casualties through conventional bombing faced a psychologically lower barrier to authorizing the same basic outcome through a new and more efficient weapon, since the raw number of dead in Tokyo that March already exceeded what either atomic bomb would ultimately produce on its own. Whether that connection changes how either decision should be judged is, again, a question this channel isn't going to resolve. But it's difficult to tell the story of the atomic bombings honestly without acknowledging that Operation Meetinghouse came first, killed more people in a single night than either bomb would on its own, and barely registered as a turning point in the public memory of the war the way Hiroshima and Nagasaki eventually would. So here's where this one actually lands. And it resists the clean resolution a shorter, tidier version of this story usually reaches for. Both things can be true. Operation Meetinghouse may well have contributed to shortening a war that was, by any honest accounting, going to end in an enormous number of deaths, regardless of which path the Allies chose to take toward Japan's surrender. And it was, on its own specific terms, a raid deliberately designed to kill as many civilians as possible in a single night, ordered by a man who understood that and never claimed otherwise. The question of whether the first fact justifies the second isn't one this channel is going to resolve for you in the next few minutes, and it isn't one that 8 decades of historians, generals, and ethicists arguing about it have resolved either. What's certain is the number. Somewhere close to 100,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians, were dead by dawn, in a single night, from a decision one general made almost entirely on his own, a decision that reshaped the rest of the air war against Japan, and that still sits, uneasily, at the center of how history judges the campaign that ended the Second World War. If you want more of the real, documented history of the war in the Pacific, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you come down on what LeMay ordered that night.